Hi, this is Delegate Steve Aarons, District 36, representing Kent, Queen Anne, Cecil, and Caroline counties, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. It's February 8th, 2024. Michael Sanderson, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, Kevin. Feeling the flow of session. We kind of went through a week of the synopses. This is the daily list of bills coming in when the Senate had their bill introduction deadline, and that is always a big time for those of us who are looking day by day at new bills, like big, thick. We had one that was like 93 pages long of new bills and so forth. So I don't know, like that's a little bit oddly energizing. You feeling the same way?
Yeah, no, it is. It's also exhausting, but it's
Yeah.
this is session, so we're feeling it for sure. There are a lot of bills, and today we want to get a little bit deeper into formula funding. A lot of time, formula funding, it's all about predictable and stable funding. When you do formulaic funding, and in Annapolis, many stakeholders feel like it's a gold standard, the best place to be. So today we want to talk about what happens when your formula fails, or at least leaves your predictable funding suddenly worse off than expected, right? So a lot of stuff is formulaic, Michael, particularly a lot of the funding that flows through to counties. So when the formula is less than you expect, or the formula gets rebased, you're dealing with a hole all of a sudden. So let's get into that a little bit, and let's talk about some of these formulas and why they're so significant for counties.
Right. I think here's where we are. We are a couple weeks after seeing the governor's budget plan and the reconciliation bill that comes with it. Our county leaders have now had 2 weeks of guest presentations from the legislative staff. The Department of Legislative Services came in and gave their sort of big picture analysis. Then we had Secretary Grady from Budget Management and some of her sort of senior leaders walk us through nuts and bolts of things that affected local governments and answered some questions and so forth. So our county folks are absorbing this. They're seeing the pieces that come back home, and we felt like this was worth digging a little more into. Like nobody's doing this. Like no one likes to tear this stuff apart and give this big context. The legislative budget committees will spend some time on this in their hearings and so forth. But if you're a listener to the podcast and you like this brand that we're on, like we're gonna do it here. This is the nerd stuff, right? This is like the album that has a warning on it that there's going to be certain language in the album, and brace yourself for it. So this podcast maybe needs a like lots of numbers salty warning, right?
We'll just put your picture on the front, right? And that would be the universal nerd warning. I think that would work.
I can own that, yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So with Michael's warning, if you're still with us and you're okay with that, we want to talk about the Disparity Grant and then a little bit about program Open Space. These are two programs that Maryland policymakers set up many, many years ago. Both of them have special funding by law. So rather than just fighting each year in the budget debate, both of them have predictable funding. All of them, again, these are formulaic, so they're predictable to an extent, but both of those formulas are kind of going over a cliff this year, Michael. And I think Disparity Grant and POS, program Open Space, are really decent policy areas to talk about here when you talk about formulaic funding, especially because of what we're seeing this year.
Right. So I think we wanted to unpack why this is happening. We had a meeting here in Annapolis yesterday. We had a number of our county officials were in town for the state of the state. And, there are a lot of people in town for that. A lot of people were at the MACO offices and participating with our meeting and so forth. We had some back and forth about the disparity grant calculation. So I wanted to start there. And then I feel like program Open Space with a weird circumstance this year is worth the conversation as well. So yeah, let's dig into both of those two. I think it's worth our while because both of them have like an element of math, but then it leaves you with a policy question of what do you do about it, if anything? And both of those are timely.
Right. So let's start with the Disparity Grant. And the Disparity Grant is basically an extension of each county's income tax. And Michael, you were there when the whole thing got created, right? I mean, usually when I ask that question, the answer is yes. So I'm figuring you were around when this whole Disparity Grant formula was created way back when.
Right. It is true. And this is back to the beginning of my time in Annapolis. But my first sessions in Annapolis were in the early 1990s. There was a pretty substantial recession. I don't think we had the guff to call it the Great Recession or whatever, like came around later. But still, Maryland, like a lot of governments, was going through a tough time. The economy slows down. That means your tax revenues slow down. But at the same time, you have more people who are looking for help, people who are out of a job or down on their luck. They're looking to programs like Medicaid and that sort of stuff that the state at least partially funds and supports. So the state budget was in a really bad circumstance. That means you end up with budget cuts. There was a whole package of tax increases at the time, sort of the whole bit, right? And among the things that the General Assembly was doing, along with the governor, to help make the budget plan work and come to a balanced budget and get out of town, was they made cuts to a number of different programs in local aid that went to local governments. And sometimes we say, why is it that counties don't get a share of like the alcohol tax from the state? Well, they used to up until the early 1990s, and the state legislature sort of had to come up with a package of things to balance the budget, and a lot of assistance to local governments ended up getting cut back there. That's why we have such a short list of things that we still have a stake on in the budgets these days. It's not as broad as it once was. But when they cut local aid, they knew that they were making deep enough cuts that the General Assembly then felt they needed to offset it in part with some new local taxing authority to say, okay, we know you may want to maintain services. So if you do, here's an extra tool. Maryland was already in the business of having local income taxes. Back then, we called it the piggyback tax, and it was expressed as a percent of your state tax liability. But they let counties bump from a 50% to a 60% rate of what you owed the state. And expanding income tax as a way to fill the gap in local services might have worked okay if you're a relatively wealthy jurisdiction. But for the lower income parts of the state, you don't get much from your income tax. You can tax your people all you want, but if they don't have a lot of income, then there's not a whole lot of revenue to provide services. So the state recognized there was an equity problem in using the income tax to fill the gap on local aid cuts. And they said, okay, we're going to create this program to say, if you're levying that local income tax and you're not getting very much juice relative to the rest of the state, we'll bring you closer to the state average. So that's the idea of the disparity grant. You levy your local income taxes, and even if you're pretty poor, we'll give you some of the yield as if you are a little bit closer to the state average. But it's all about where you are relative to the rest of the state.
All right, so those basically are the nuts and bolts of the grant formula, but you ended it with an important point, I think. It's not really how much your residents have in taxable income. It's really about where you are relative to the state average. And that is really relevant right now, right, Michael?
Yeah, so that's what has this front burner right now for a number of our counties. So I mean, mostly the story comes down to think of most of us who our income comes from having a job, right? The taxable income of most families is because our family has one or two people in the family who have a job. We make income, and year to year, our wages are relatively stable, right? You might get a promotion, or you might get an annual raise, or you might change from one job to another, but you don't have huge jarring changes. You have one job this year, you probably will have one job next year. It'll probably be fairly comparable. Maybe you get lucky and you make 10% more money, but you don't have giant moves in your family income. We think of most income that way, and for most people who pay taxes, that's income taxes is based on money we make in our employment, in our jobs.
Right, and for you and me, that's the case. But I mean, I've been around our county budget officers for long enough to know that it is non-wage income that really moves around the most. So things like business income, and most especially, and the hardest to predict, Michael, capital gains.
Right. So that's the rub, right? So the slice of people who make their money because they're a part owner of a business, or because they have meaningful investments, or they're buying and selling property or other things like that. When those taxpayers have a really good year, they file their taxes at the end of a really good year, they crushed it, and they cashed out a bunch of beneficial investments. They made a really good year on the stock market and cashed out a bunch of appreciated stocks. They pay capital gains on that income, or in the appreciation of real estate or other things like that. But after a good year, when that happens to a lot of people, like after a stock market rally, it can inflate the overall income that's being paid by all Marylanders. So that's kind of bringing up the average, even if a lot of us who are, paycheck people, we didn't cash out a whole bunch of stocks. We didn't have an extraordinary year. I didn't get any poorer, but relative to the state average, I look poorer.
Right. And Michael, importantly, even just a few of the big hitters take a lot in terms of capital gains. That can shift the wealth formula for the entire state. That can shift how wealthy counties are relative to others, even if just a few of the big hitters take a bunch of gains. And so it is odd, and it is always a reminder that there are even a few taxpayers in Maryland can move the needle. So when you talk about the stock market, that was the situation with the stock market last year, coming off a pretty good year for businesses and investments. And for fiscal 24, the state was bringing in some extra money because of capital gains. So that makes sense. They had money to help along the areas that were further behind. And that's how the disparity grant is supposed to work, right? So the state had some extra cash to make sure that, areas that are already behind don't fall further behind because they just don't have that taxable base.
Right. So that's kind of the conversation about what was going on with the disparity grant like 1 year ago, as the FY24 budget was proposed and being considered. It was like, okay, this is going to provide a little bit of extra help. Okay, got it. And things are going well, and not everybody's been benefiting. And so we're going to do a little sharing of the wealth and the disparity grants there. This year, though, the data isn't so high. We don't have the spikes on the high end that we saw a year ago. So, things have kind of slowed down in the overall economy. Not that the economy is terrible, but the stock market didn't roar last year in the way that it did the year prior and so forth. There's not as much of that non-wage income, not as many people cashing in big capital gains and having one-time windfalls that are taxable and so forth. So what that means is a few big hitters, or the wave of big hitters, don't have a big year, and the statewide average comes down. So it's like, the happy days are no longer here. They stalled a little bit on us. So when the state average falls, if you're a relatively poor county, you probably didn't have all that many of those big hitters, right? Notwithstanding the occasional super lotto winner from out in Lonaconing or whatever. Okay, but generally speaking, in the poorer parts of the state, you don't have tons of folks who are having big capital gains years and having big business income and that sort of stuff. So your numbers never really boomed along with the rest of the state. If you're in a disparity grant county where folks just don't have as much income to tax as the rest of the state, now the state fell back to you, but by the formula, it looks like you caught up to them. It looks like you just had a wealthy year and you don't need as much help.
Right. So that's what's going on in this year in places like Wacomico County. Their disparity grant drops like $2 million. And that's real money. That's a lot of money to them in a fairly small, fairly poor county. If the story was that they had a big gain in wealth locally, and that was turning into higher local taxes so they wouldn't need the state grant, that would be great news, but that is not the story.
Right. So this is the case of the math behind this formula makes sense in an academic setting. And then you have a challenge like right now, where there's not a whole lot of extra money to go around, and suddenly the state is being asked to do less because its average came down, and a place like Wicomico ends up losing money at a time when, it's not because Wicomico got wealthy, right? Just like you said, it's not because they suddenly made a big gain and caught up to the pack. It's the pack fell back to them, but the effect is the same. And so you end up with, this really tough situation. $2 million in Wicomico, like you said, that's a real number down there.
Right. I mean, they're still left, though, with a decline of $2 million in their budget. And this is at a time when that's the last thing you need. We've already talked about some budget pressures. We know that highway users are on the chopping block, highway user revenues. We have a Band-Aid for fiscal 25, but we're going to feel that. in fiscal 26 and beyond. We know that there's a proposal to cut community college funding, disparity grants, right? All of these things adds up. There are so many budget pressures, not to mention the blueprint, right? And so
Right.
it's just one of those things, right? You're left with this $2 million hole. You really can't afford it. But this formula is very, very noisy. And Michael, it has caught legislators' attention before, right?
Yeah, I think so. As you can imagine, you have good years and bad years with the stock market or with the overall business climate or that sort of thing. And so we've always known that things like this non-wage income that comes from things other than people just having jobs, but having business interests and capital gains and so forth, it moves around, it bumps around, it's tough to predict, and it makes things like you almost always miss your prediction on the income tax. The people like Andy Shuffle and the smart people at the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, will always do their best to make a guess, but you can never hit the income tax because you just never know what's going to happen with this part of it. So sometimes you get a big spike in funding for basically, the formula just says, okay, well, the jurisdictions, the 9, 10, 11 counties who are going to get a disparity grant, the number goes up. And sometimes, something that is substantially more than the year before, that triggers just like an affordability problem for the state. The state is really good at saying, well, last year we were able to afford this much. So this year, like, we have a little more capacity, we can bump things up, but we can't afford a 17% increase in that line item. What the heck's going on over there? So the analyst digs in and comes up with recommendations. But what happens when the state has a problem with affordability in one program or one line item. You've seen how that goes.
Right. I mean, lots of times we see something like a budget reconciliation bill, part of the annual budget plan, and that can override state law. So the budget reconciliation bill, when the state has a problem, they can't just say we're not going to fund mandated formulas. So they have an accompanying bill that allows them to change those formulas. So we know that they do that when things get too pricey. They institute caps, right? So if they see a formula that's too expensive, they'll cap the formula, and that's what happened. The fiscal analyst said the formula was bouncing around too much, and they put into law that a cap, so no county would receive more than its fair share in fiscal 2010. So the Disparity Grant Program has been capped at this point.
Right. So here's where you go, right? You end up with, you put something into law with a formula, but it gets tricky and then it bounces around. It's a little noisy. It's not as simple as every year it's just going to be 2% more than last year or bumped by the CPI. It's calculated each year based on data. And there's nothing inherently wrong with the data, but that makes it tough. And so when they get pricey, they get capped. But here we are on the flip side. Now the bottom fell out. So what do you do now?
Right. And, this is something we've been talking about. And what do you do? There are options. You could do some kind of a smoothing. And that's what the Kirwan Commission did when they saw the effect of student enrollment making strange outcomes. They went to a 3-year moving average. And that was all in an attempt to smooth out the highs and the lows. The formula there is the greater of the latest year or the 3-year average, a smooth landing if you're going to drop. So there's a possibility that you could do some sort of smoothing effect with the disparity grant.
Right. And again, part of the reason you would do that as a matter of policy, this feels like, well, why do you go to the trouble to make it so complicated? Right. Now it's a whole page of text describing how to calculate the numbers. But the reason you do that is because predictability is actually a reasonable policy goal. The idea of a program kind of knowing that next year's funding is going to be, built on the same data and the same principles as last year's funding gives you a sense that, well, we're not left to the vagaries of the full appropriations process where, one year you get 30 million and one year you get 6 million, then the next it's 0 and then the next it's 40. And it's hard to build a program based on something that just bounce around is unpredictable. You love to have the predictability of, hey, it's written in the law. Here's the formula. We'll just calculate it each year. But then things get trouble. So then you end up with guardrails. You end up with hold harmlesses or other things like that. But, predictability is not a ridiculous thing to embrace as a matter of policy.
Right. And the General Assembly is often fond of things like a hold harmless when funding is about to go down for one reason or another. here, I mean, we have 6 counties losing funding, and it's a big deal to all 6 of them. This is $30 million to Prince George's County, and I know what they went through to fund their share of the blueprint last year, Michael. So, I mean, this is a big deal. It's a big deal for the 6 counties losing money, and it is, again, real money.
Right. Okay, so folks, if you've made it this far, okay, it wasn't super deep with math, honestly, but there it is, right? I mean, the arithmetic of saying there's a policy concept behind these grants, and we're going to make sure that we don't leave the less wealthy parts of the state behind too far, because they need these revenues just for general revenues of covering for expenses. That's the math, that's the policy, and now you're kind of caught up on the politics. A $2 million cliff effect in a place like Wicomico, $30 million in Prince George's. These are counties that are going to struggle to make this year's budget come together anyway. And now suddenly they've got a line item of general revenue that can go right towards their part of the blueprint, that can go, right toward maintaining, they're paying the everyday staff to keep the lights on and so forth. This is general revenue for those counties. And you fall off a cliff like that. I mean, I think they're right to come to Annapolis and say, you can't have this. Like, you can't have us fall off a $30 million cliff in Prince George's County. Even $600,000 in Caroline. Like, they're our tiniest and, at least by some measurements, the poorest county in Maryland. They lose $600,000. Like, that is a big mover in Caroline County. So that's what we're talking about. That's why we thought this was worth trying to untangle a little bit on the podcast. Little math, little politics, but the disparity grant deserves the attention it's going to get.
I agree. And I think there's no good reason why these numbers should be jumping around as much as they are. I mean, $30 million, I guarantee you, none of these counties have the money to backfill the drop, right? So last year they had a certain amount, and now it's cut drastically in those 6 counties, and they have to find a way to recoup those losses. And that's either going to come through raising revenue or cutting services. And no one wants to cut services at this point, right? So I think that this is a great conversation, and it's well worth a deep dive into how we could attempt to smooth it out in some way. But Michael, we've gone through a little bit of a complicated formula, the disparity grant, and I know you're not content. You really want to dive into program open space.
I do. I mean, I do. Okay, so here's the thing. I think that what's interesting about program open space is it's actually a really smart idea.
Great.
So this actually predates me. This goes back, I think, to the 1970s. But the concept in Maryland is a really good one, that we take a particular revenue source that is connected to development and sales of real estate, and we take the money that comes from that activity and we use it to fund a bunch of things that are related to development and to real estate and so forth. So I think it's a really interesting one. And once again, we're seeing kind of the underbelly of a formula like that.
I also agree. It's a really smart formula. I think it's one of the best policies that we have. And again, it just makes sense. But this is another formula, right, Michael? Program open space is based on a formula.
Yeah, it kind of is. Really, I guess technically it's more a dedicated funding source, but there's a twist, and both of the pieces of the twist are clicking right now in kind of a sad direction. So let me walk through it a little bit. We have a transfer tax. The state levies a transfer tax on the sale of real property. You go buy a pair of shoes, you pay 6% on the shoes. If you go buy an office building or a home, you pay a 0.5% transfer tax. And, you can have these broad conversations about the philosophy of taxation and so forth, but a modest rate tax at the point of transaction is, generally speaking, one of the components that most places use as a broad-based revenue system. So we use the transfer tax levied by the state as a dedicated revenue that goes to these related programs. So that's what a lot of people think is really cool policy here in Maryland. You fund things that are related to development pressures and land use by way of the money that comes from that activity. So we're really good at agricultural land preservation. We have a whole foundation and program that helps farmers keep their land in active ag and so forth. And the money for that comes out of the state transfer tax. We also do a number of different programs in a variety of like historical preservation and things of that nature, some credits, but also like programs and so forth. A lot of that money comes through the state transfer tax. Again, preserve the old stuff while people are running around buying new stuff. And then in addition to those things, we fund a hallmark program in Maryland, Program Open Space. It's a big project that is split between the state and the county governments. Essentially, it is our flagship program for both land preservation itself, just buying land and getting it off the market and getting it to escape development pressure. But then also, most of the money that goes to locals is used to create active recreation sites. Sometimes we buy sites, but we also put up our parks. We also build the ball fields or the nature trails or the places to put in your canoe or all that kind of stuff. Public recreation, the places where you can take the family, all that sort of stuff, that stuff is largely funded through Maryland's Program Open Space program. So when stuff is selling and there's pressure on real estate, we make a bunch of money and we send it to things that sort of preserve some of that land, but also make our places more livable. That's a really great idea.
Right. And it's not just you and me that think this is a great idea, great program, great model. Maryland's program Open Space is a national model. Other states look at Maryland to see and learn how we did it, right? So there's a lot of good in program Open Space, but then, Michael, maybe some not so good.
Right. So sadly, we're experiencing the downside of this sort of dedicated funding source. And the twist is it's a little bit tough to fund a program that's based on the estimate of how much tax revenue you're going to have come in the door for the year ahead, right? So when you have a dedicated revenue, like the money from this tax is going to go to these programs, one way to solve that, and I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with the way we do that, is basically we'll spend the money based on an estimate. And then once the books are closed on a given year, we'll look and see whether the taxes really made it to our estimate. Sometimes they will exceed the estimate and we'll have an overage. Sometimes they'll be short of the estimate and we'll be short. And you basically take that carryover and you settle it up in the next budget year once you have the data. So today we're sitting and looking at the administration's proposal for how to build the FY25 budget. That's July of 24 through June of 25 is FY25. Well, we're not done with FY24. We're in the middle of that. So we don't have data on that. What we do have data is we know where things landed for FY23 that ended last summer. So that feels kind of old. But what happens is for Program Open Space and all the other programs that depend on the transfer tax, we're going to fund them this year in two pieces. One is based on a guess for what we think is going to happen with the state transfer tax this coming year. But then also we're going to reconcile what actually happened 2 years ago, and that's FY23.
Right. So this thing moves with the real estate market. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a big shock in interest rates as the Federal Reserve has tried to get inflation under control. And that really changes things for real estate. And we have certainly seen that here in Maryland and across the country.
For sure. Right. Exactly. So dialing back one extra click, like FY22, if we can remember that long ago, it feels like it was 15 years ago, but we're kind of during the pandemic and folks have realized things are different and so forth. But this is, the summer and winter of 21 and into early 2022, real estate market was actually strong. Interest rates were still super low. And that was a year where the state tallies up the number for FY22 and we over-attained our estimate. So the transfer tax came in strong. That was extra money. And just like we described, it's 2 years later where the extra money actually shows up. So it got tossed on top of the estimate for 24. So FY24 was actually a healthy year for Program Open Space and other things that are funded by the transfer tax. because of the 22 overattainment. So you had a little sort of lagniappe on top in 24, despite the markets sort of cooling off by that time. And that brings us to now. So this year in FY25, we get sort of the double hit because the cool down in the market really happened in FY23. That's when, like you mentioned, the Federal Reserve changes basically the reference interest rate goes from basically zero, starts creeping up to 1.5%, 2.5%. Now it's up near 5% or thereabout and so forth. But that happened over the space of a year and a half. And it was an effort to cool off inflation and a kind of a crazy labor market and supply chain issues and so forth. But one thing it definitely did was it cooled the real estate market, right? We know interest rates are very much a part of affordability for housing. And we're feeling that in today's market with relatively high interest rates. So here we are today in a not so strong housing market. So our base number for the transfer tax is not great, but we are eating a nasty sandwich. I don't want to say the bad word, even if we put a label on it. We are eating a nasty sandwich of underattainment from FY23 that gets layered into this year's number. So we start weak, and then we get like punched in the gut because we're taking the negative number because 23 came in so weak.
Right. So that's a big ouch. And if you put all that together, and the state side of program open space falls from about 90 million last year to something like 26 million this year. I mean, wow, that's a big drop, and that does not happen very often.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't. So you got two compounding effects. Actually, there's one more twist in there. I'm terrified to have the writing in the margin now, but there also is one more compounding factor that makes it even tougher on the local side of program open space. There was sort of a one-off political deal back in, it was the special session in 2007. But one of the things that came out of there were lots of moving parts, but they took $21 million out of the local side of program open space, transfer tax money that otherwise would have gone to local POS, and they used it to fund the operations of the state parks. Honestly, there was a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, I wish there was a lot of attention on state parks, and they came up with some extra funding and accelerated some things and did some more things. A lot of people were going to the parks and finding them closed or too busy, that sort of stuff. So we doubled down on the state parks. I wish we had fixed this dumb thing. We didn't do it then. We probably never will, I guess. But we're losing 21 million off the top out of our local POS as well.
Yeah, and I remember you being a little bit testy about that when that all happened, and there was an opportunity to make the fix. So the bottom line now is that we get a double whammy with the market slowing down. We feel the effects of the soft number from 2 years ago, and we still lose 21 million off the top of a much smaller pool. Okay, then. I mean, that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. It kind of feels like somebody's getting screwed in that deal, but okay.
Okay, so if that's the math, now let's try and shift over to policy, right? So what do you do about it? If we're trying to tie, these tricky, weird formulas, and like we've laid the groundwork, why 90 million bucks turns into 26 overnight, that seems bananas. Like almost no one ever does that unless you've decided this program is a loser and you want to just like let it die on the vine. No one is saying program open space is a bad program. I don't think there's anybody who's out to get these projects. It's just the workings of the formula and this extra 21 million and so forth. So, does this sound like something you need to go and tend to right now? Right. That's the policy question for today.
Right. And I guess there are big differences in these programs. I mean, we mentioned at the top, community college funding, you cut that, and it feels like that triggers tuition increases like right now. Right. So that feels urgent. With the Disparity Grant, that's money these counties need to fund their budget, to pay their staff, to live up to their share of the blueprint. Again, that's something you feel right now. But with POS, you don't lay off staff if you get your cut. You just delay a project for a year or two, right? And I guess in the eyes of some legislators, that is a big difference here. And it's not as apparent that it's a right now problem that has to be fixed.
Right. I think that probably ends up being some of the context where policymakers may see these programs differently. I mean, another thing that's kind of quirky is the funding for program open space doesn't come directly out of the state's general fund. And so that's a little bit different as well. It's
Mhm.
often a special fund. You can still move money from one place to another in that big reconciliation bill. But I think project-based programs, like you want to do a project, right? You have a plot of land and you're saying this would be a really good place for us to buy up these 13 acres and turn it into active recreation because we know this is a growth area in our comprehensive plan. We've got water and sewer extending out that way, and the roadways are built to carry the extra load. And like, we're planning for growth. We know people are going to live there, but like, you can say like, okay, we can wait 18 months to build that. You can probably do that. You don't lay staff off. You don't shut down the library, right? It feels different when they're projects rather than day-to-day functions. Listen, we work really closely with our park and recreation departments, and we work really well with stakeholders like the Partners for Open Space. There's a lot of folks who believe active recreation is a really high priority and needs to be, and I'm with it. But I think the conversation might be different as you're like on the bleeding edge of what you can and can't afford in the budget. It's possible that Annapolis will see things differently for that reason.
Yes, and I'll tell you, this certainly felt like a blur. We went all the way back to 1992, and then we talked about a cap put into law in 2011. Then we're counting dollars from 2023 to 2025. Then you reminded us of what happened in 2007. I mean, it feels like a lot, definitely.
It is, right? It is a lot. That's why the warning up front that this was going to be a little bit of a ride. But I think this stuff is interesting and it's important. And the budgeteers who are working through this stuff, the Senate's going to move the budget first this year. The House is going to have to come up with their own plan. They're going to have to work everything out by early April. They're going to have a bunch of consequential policy decisions to make along the way that are different from the simple, hey, does this get funded 3% more or 4% more than last year? And some of this stuff is where you express your priorities when you do fiscal policy. You build a budget, you fund it with the resources you can find, and you put it into the places where you think you're going to make the most difference and so forth. That's what they want to do. I think everybody's working in good faith. When we raise issues like the community colleges, like the plight of these jurisdictions who are on the wrong side of the disparity grant, these programs who are totally upside down with their plans for livability in their communities through program open space, like, this is consequential stuff. This is quality of life in Maryland, just like how, this is our calling card. This is a great place to live, work, and play. We want to make it great. We want to make those investments. It's tough stuff they've got to resolve. So anyway, there's policy here, not just tedious math, but sometimes you gotta take the medicine a little bit.
Well, Michael, formulas are everybody's way to get funded right up until they're not. Right? Well,
yeah. So anyway, if you're looking for stuff in the budget that's not quite sexy enough to be above the fold and in the papers and getting featured write-ups from the many people who cover this sort of stuff, that's why you're coming to the Conduit Street Podcast, because we're going to break this kind of stuff down for you. I think it's interesting, and we'll all be watching.
All right, Michael, was that cathartic? Did you get everything out?
Okay.
Do you want to talk about any more formulas, or are you okay for now?
That's good. I might be able to stop pacing for a day or two. That was pretty good.
That's good. That's good. All right, well, we'll wrap it up there then. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all these episodes get sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. That is on fire right now. There are multiple articles every single day. You can keep up with what Mako is doing when we're at the testimony table, big breaking news, etc. So we'll leave it there for today. For Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.